April 22, 1945. Hitler, in his bunker in Berlin, has been asking all morning about the results of the offensive that Steiner should have started during the first hours of that day. Finally, at the midday meeting, his top advisors can no longer hide the reality and inform him that Steiner has been unable to launch any offensive. This news meant that Zhukov's First Belarusian Front would continue to concentrate all its efforts on the assault on Berlin, which, also being attacked by Konya from the south, would soon be surrounded. Once Berlin was isolated, there was little guarantee that its weak garrison could contain the Soviet advance towards central Berlin. The capital of the Reich was finally surrounded on April 24, from which point a relentless Soviet advance began towards the central district of Berlin, nicknamed the Citadel, where the main buildings of the German government were located, and the own bunker where Hitler was. During the day of April 28, the Soviets reached the north bank of the Spree River, finally being able to see the great building of the Reichstag, in a similar way to the one that 3.5 years before the Germans had seen the Kremlin in Moscow. However, the difference was clear. While the Germans had come to see the Kremlin with their last breath, the Soviets still had strength and energy to continue attacking with great ferocity. Although the Soviets thought that the Reichstag was Hitler's main building of power, and therefore the one they had set as their priority objective, the truth was that since the fire of 1933, the building had not been used in any way officially for any parliamentary session. In reality, the important government building was the Reich Chancellery, located about 700 meters to the southeast, which housed Hitler's bunker in its backyard. Other important buildings located in that sector of the Citadel were the Kroll Opera and the Ministry of the Interior building, which were located in front of the Reichstag. Because the Soviets crossed the river just northwest of the Reichstag, these two were the buildings they first encountered. Both the Reichstag building and the Ministry of the Interior were very solid stone constructions that withstood all the artillery impacts very well. To prepare for the defense of both buildings, most of the windows and doors were bricked up with stone blocks or wood, and sandbags were stacked against their walls. There were machine guns in the corner towers, and above the main entrance there were entrenched positions, forming interlocking fields of fire. Despite the numerous bombings by both the aviation and the one that the Soviet artillery was beginning to carry out against them, the thick walls absorbed the punishment without collapsing. The central government sector in Berlin would be the toughest nut for the Soviets to crack, as it contained most of the elite troops still remaining in the capital. In the vicinity of the Reichstag building was Waffen SS General Wilhelm Mohnke, who had been appointed Commander-in-Chief of the defense of the government district of Berlin, nicknamed the Citadel. The main core of his forces was the Waffen SS Guard battalion belonging to the Leibstandard, assigned to Hitler's protection, which was made up of about 800 men. They were joined by other Waffen SS units whose headquarters were in Berlin, which included troops from Himmler's Guard, whose strength amounted to 600 men. Finally, it should be noted that there were also a few dozen French soldiers belonging to the SS Charlemagne Division, who had been part of the destroyed SS Norland Division. It should be said that the rest of the elite units of the Waffen SS, including the rest of the Leibstandard, Das Reich, Totenkopf, Viking, and Hitlerjugend, were in the vicinity of Vienna after their failed offensive in the vicinity of the Lake Balaton, and the subsequent Soviet counterattack. Russian officers on the north bank of the Spree River thought that there were about 5,000 German soldiers in the vicinity of the Reichstag. However, in reality, it was defended by no more than 2,000 troops. Of all of them, about 550 men were entrenched inside the Reichstag building, ready to fight their final battle. One of the main protagonists in the defense of the Reichstag building was Waffen SS Lieutenant Barbick, who was in command of one of the Leibstandard companies made up of 100 soldiers. Shortly before the Soviet assault on his position, Barbick received another 100 men from the decimated 9th Parachute Division, which had been retreating from the Silo Hills. With regard to heavy weapons support, Barbick had only two 88mm guns outside the Reichstag, and could also count on the large 128mm guns at the Flak Tower west of Tiergarten Park, which were about 2 kilometers from your position. Luckily for the German lieutenant, he still had telephone contact with the garrison of this anti-aircraft tower. Thus, on April 27, the German lieutenant established his command post in the basement of a ruined house behind the Reichstag and prepared for battle. On the other hand, Stalin had informed his two front commanders, Marshals Zhukov and Konev, that capturing the Reichstag would mean winning the race to take Berlin. Soviet forces, belonging to Zhukov's First Belarusian Front, had reached the banks of the Spree River during the night of April 27. In front of them was the Maltka Bridge, which led them directly to the Reichstag, between the destroyed buildings of the Kroll Opera and the Ministry of the Interior, which the Soviets called Himmler's house. It was not going to be easy for them to cross the bridge, which would form a bottleneck that would cause heavy casualties, but they had no other option. The Soviet plan was to send a couple of battalions across the bridge, take the diplomatic headquarters, and then assault the Ministry of the Interior with new forces that had already crossed the river. The attacking Soviet 79th Rifle Corps had 3 infantry divisions available. Each division had 2 regiments of 3 battalions, each with about 500 men per battalion. In addition, the 23rd Tank Brigade was also present to help. In total, the Soviet assault force is estimated at least 10,000 infantry and about 80 tanks. The attack began with thunderous fire from Soviet artillery, using both artillery guns and rocket launchers, which bombarded the vicinity of the Reichstag before the infantry began to cross the bridge. It was shortly after midnight on April 29 when the Soviet artillery opened fire, which was followed by the infantry assault. By dawn, the best units of the 150th and 171st Rifle Divisions had entered the diplomatic quarter, under direct fire from the 128mm guns on the Zoo Tower, 2 kilometers away. Despite the distance at which it was located, the support given by this anti-aircraft tower was vital, since it managed to destroy most of the Soviet tanks that tried to cross the bridge. While the Russians were establishing their first positions south of the Spree River, the Germans counterattacked with the remains of the 9th Parachute Division, which charged along the river bank on the Soviet left flank. Due to the weakness of the attack, in which barely 100 men participated, the German counterattack quickly stalled. Subsequently, the survivors of the 9th Parachute Division retreated inside the Reichstag. On the other hand, members of the Soviet 150th Division attacked the Ministry of the Interior, which due to its large size and the tenacity of its defenders, could not be taken until the afternoon of April 30th. Although the defenders were fewer than the Soviets thought, the resistance was much greater. Regardless of the difficulties encountered, Stalin wanted the Reichstag to be taken before May 1st, so that the red flag could be raised on its roof, due to the strong symbolic load of said date. To meet this demand, Soviet commanders on the ground were forced to redouble their efforts. To this end, the exhausted battalions of the 150th Rifle Division launched an assault on the Reichstag at 7:30 a.m. on April 30th, which was repulsed by the Waffen SS troops defending the building. During that morning, General Wilhelm Mohnke himself had gone to Hitler's bunker to inform him that the resistance of his men would only be possible for 20 more hours. After that time, the Soviets would reach Hitler's bunker. Shortly after the first Soviet assault on the Reichstag was repulsed, the 207th Rifle Division was sent to capture the Kroll Opera House. This attack made some progress, and tanks, self-propelled guns, and Katyusha rocket launchers were used to reinforce the assault. After the failure of the first assault on the Reichstag, the second Soviet attempt took place at 11:30 a.m. Unfortunately for them, the Germans also managed to stop him, although they were running out of ammunition. Shortly later, around 1 p.m., the Soviets carried out a third attempt, which was also stopped short thanks to the help of shots fired from the anti-aircraft tower southwest of the Tiergarten. Meanwhile, at 6 in the afternoon, the Kroll Opera completely fell into Soviet hands. Less than a kilometer from there, Hitler committed suicide in his bunker around 4 in the afternoon. The final Soviet assault on the Reichstag took place at nightfall on April 30th, supported by artillery and numerous tanks. Finally, one of the Soviet artillery shells managed to open a hole in one of the bricked-up entrances to the Reichstag, through which Soviet troops began to enter the building en masse. What followed next was a grim struggle room by room, and floor by floor. After a few hours, a group of Soviet troops reported by telephone that they had reached the top floor of the building. Immediately afterwards, the special banner with the Soviet flag was sent, with orders to place the flag on top of the building before midnight at all costs. For their part, a small group of 25 soldiers managed to place their banner on a damaged statue at the top of the building, even though fighting continued for several more hours on the lower floors of the Reichstag. The flag in the famous photograph, which wanted to compete with the one recently taken by the Americans on Iwo Jima, was fixed by Captain Makov and a group of artillery non-commissioned officers on the statue of the Goddess of Victory. However, these events were recreated in daylight on May 1st for Soviet propaganda services, and that was the photo that was spread throughout the world. This act by no means marked the end of the fighting in Berlin, which in some sectors continued until May 2nd. Regarding the German garrison led by Lieutenant Barbick, it should be noted that during the last hours of the battle inside the Reichstag, both he and about 100 survivors managed to leave the building and headed north. Although their objective was to leave the city, they were finally surrounded by the Soviets and surrendered during the morning of May 2nd. Finally, the casualties of the Soviet soldiers who stormed the Reichstag are estimated at around 500, and the Germans at slightly less. So, what did you think of this program? Do you want to continue seeing the evolution of the Soviet assault on the Chancellery, and on Hitler's bunker? I leave this video in the description along with the program we have with Carlos Caballero Jurado about the Battle of Berlin, and our Telegram channel to which I invite you all to join.